Hello, my name's Aviva, and today I wanted to share with you all of my thoughts on all of the books that I read this past week. So first of all, I apologize if you end up hearing the rain that's going on in the background, but it has been raining all day and I don't think it's going to stop. So I just have to film this video now or else you guys aren't going to get it. And also that is why it's pretty gloomy in here. But either way, it doesn't really matter. Hopefully you guys don't mind the unfortunate circumstances of my current surroundings. But basically, I have 7 books that I wanted to share with you today. So let's get into it. First up, I read Gracie and the Grunt this week, which had come out last Friday. It was a surprise release by Mariana Zapata, and I was very excited to start reading it. I didn't even look at the synopsis before I started reading the book, and then I found out very slowly that it's basically about this girl named Gracie who lives on her own in the middle of nowhere, and one night this superhero, yes, like Marvel, Superman, that sort of vibe, a superhero falls out of the sky onto her front lawn, and he is injured, and basically she's going to end up taking care of him. And then we slowly find out that he's extremely grumpy, and it's more or less going to end up being their romance. So the thing is that I got about 275 pages in before I decided that I just could not do it anymore, and I ended up DNFing it. And that is pretty crazy, I know, because Mariana Zapata is one of my favorite authors of all time, except I was so freaking bored by the story. I wasn't really connecting to the characters whatsoever, and even though she tried to do something a little bit different and unique, unfortunately it did not work for me, and I did have to DNF the book. So I am a little bit sad about that fact, but also I did speak to a lot of people who ended up getting to the end of the book, and they're like, yeah, you didn't miss much. Like, at the end of the day, if you weren't connecting to the characters, you're not going to connect to the romance. And the romance didn't even kick in until the 92% mark of this 600 and something page book. So there was no way that I was going to end up making it to the end to possibly enjoy the romance that was going to happen, like literally in the last couple of pages. So yeah, that was more or less my experience with the new release by Mariana Zapata. But either way, after that, I did end up picking up a book that I did end up very much enjoying, which was Give Me More by Sarah Kate. So what's funny is that this is the third book in the Salacious Players Club, and I had recently DNF'd to the first book in this series because I wasn't connecting to the characters, and this is a very like smutty series. So if you're not connecting to the characters, then you're not going to connect to the smut, and therefore the romance, whatever you're here for the book for, it's just not going to work for you. And that was exactly how I felt about book 1, and that is why I just DNF'd it like pretty early on. I'm just like, I know that this book is not for me. But then I heard about the synopsis of this book, and I was very intrigued, so I decided to give it a shot, and thankfully I did end up really enjoying my time with it. So if you're not familiar with this book, you are basically following this guy named Hunter, who is a part owner in a kinky sex club, and he happens to be married to this girl named Isabel, and they both have a best friend named Drake. And basically at the beginning of the story, all 3 of them are going to be going on vacation together around the United States to visit other sex clubs to try and get ideas to bring back to their sex club. And basically while they're out, Hunter basically realizes that he is kind of turned on by the idea of Drake, which is his best friend, getting with his wife, and he wants to watch. So he basically is going to end up propositioning the 2 of them to be like, hey, can you help my kinky fantasy come to life? And the story is more or less going to go from there. So yes, it's a very heavy on the sex sort of book. It is a very smutty book, but it also is a lot of fun. And it was honestly way more into the relationship development than I expected it to be. Like, all of the dynamics that were playing out was honestly very interesting for me to follow along with. And it was honestly way more emotional than I expected it to be. It was way more like of a real story than I expected to be. Like, I thought I was just getting into like a very smutty book, but there was a lot more going on than just that. And I really did enjoy it in the moment that I read it. And I say that very specifically because after I finished reading this book, I realized that there were some things that I'm not really sure how I felt about, even though I was enjoying it in the moment that it was happening. So I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but basically, like, I liked the story as I was reading. Like, it was very fun. All of the sex scenes I was very into. I wasn't really bored because none of them were very like, they didn't repeat themselves. Like, every time you got a new sex scene, and honestly like developed the relationship between all 3 of them in a different way. And I really liked seeing that progression. So it honestly made for a very interesting read throughout the entire thing, minus the 3rd act conflict, by the way. Like, I very much was not a fan of how that whole thing went down, and I could like sit here for 20 minutes and complain about that, but all I'm just going to say is that I didn't like the 3rd act conflict, even though the ending was like a fine enough time. But basically, after I finished reading the book, I ended up going online and I just like looked up some reviews to see what other people thought about it. And then I saw some like negative things about what people specifically pointed out, and then I realized, I'm like, you know what? I hear what you're saying, and I was a little bit like, it went over my head in the moment, but now I think that would have bothered me if I would go and reread it. Like, at some moments, like, I felt like either some people were being used or just like cast aside, because like you're dealing with 3 people in one relationship, and I thought that the balance of how it all was ended, how it all played out, was a little bit interesting at times. And basically every time I would read a negative review and then someone pointed something out, I'm like, oh, you know what? I think I might also like have similar feelings as that. And basically the further and further I got into it, the more and more confused I got about how I actually felt about the book. So I know that that sounds like super wacky, but basically basically, more or less, in the moment that I read it, I really did enjoy my time with it. But after the fact, I'm not really sure how I feel about some details that happen. So yeah, let's just stop myself here because I feel like I'm just going to keep going in circles of confusingness. So basically, yeah, I did read Give Me More this week, and I can't really tell you how I felt about it. So that is that. But anyway, after this one, I did end up picking up this book called A Nordic King by Karina Hall, or Karina Hall. I'm not really sure how to say that author's name correctly, but either way, in this book, you are following this guy who is the king of Denmark, and he's going to end up having a forbidden romance with his new nanny because he's a single dad. His wife had passed away 2 years ago in a car accident, and basically it's going to end up being their romance. So I really did end up enjoying this story, and what's funny is that I really didn't think I was going to, because I wasn't really sure how I was going to feel about the whole like royalty aspect of the book, like him being a king and the two girls being like princesses, and the whole idea of like them living in a palace and things like that. Like I like those type of things, but in my fantasy books, like I wasn't sure how I'd feel about it in a mundane setting. I thought it was going to be a little bit corny, a little bit cliche, a little bit unrealistic, and it did end up being all of those three. But I honestly really enjoyed the romance for what it was, that I just let all of that kind of slide because I kind of knew that it was coming, so I just didn't let it really get to me, and I really did end up enjoying the romance because of it. So I am very happy that I decided to give this one a chance because I almost passed up on it, but I ended up really enjoying it. So yeah, that is that. But anyway, after that one, I did end up doing a reread of Me You in the Middle by Devin Daniels. So I had read this book maybe like a year or so ago, probably like a year and a half, but either way, I really loved it at the time that I read it, and I wanted to give it a second chance to be like, oh, was it really a really good book, or was it just like in the moment that I read it when I wasn't picky? But it happens to be, I still think that it was a really good book. It is an enemies to lovers in a political setting, and I know that not everybody likes reading about political books, and I don't really like reading about political books either, but because it had that whole enemies to lovers thing going on, it made for such a good read because they had so many reasons to not get along and to banter and things like that. She's basically a Democrat working under a senator, and he is a Republican working under a different senator, and at the beginning of the book, she basically needed something from his senator, so she sets up a meeting with him, and then the meeting does not end up going well, and they basically become like enemies at that point. They really don't get along. They just have a couple of bad first encounters, so they end up basically like pulling pranks on each other, messing with each other, and then slowly throughout the book, they kind of end up just becoming friends because they're always hanging out, always talking and things like that, and then obviously slowly that will turn into lovers. So I just think that it was a really good enemies to friends to lovers sort of situation, and the political thing really added to the story instead of like annoyed me in the story. So all around the board, I really think that this was a really great book. I loved it the first time I read it. I still loved it the second time I read it, and I definitely would recommend it if it sounds like something that you might enjoy. So yeah, that is more or less Me You in the Middle by Devin Daniels. I am very happy that I decided to do a reread of this one. But anyway, after this, I did also pick up this book called Catching Kaden by Samantha Christie. So this is basically about this guy who is a professional baseball player, and at one of his games, he ends up hitting a home run, and it hits this girl in the face and ends up like, breaking her face, and she has to get surgery and everything like that. So he ends up like visiting her in the hospital, feeling really bad, and then he's more or less going to end up befriending her, and they're going to become really good friends, and then obviously that is going to turn into a romance. So the thing is that I really did enjoy the romance aspect of this book. My issue with it was every single other thing that happened surrounding the story. Like the romance in itself, it was very cute. I really connected to the characters. I really liked the chemistry that they had. I really liked how they built up a friendship and how it was like, a very good all around the board. It was just a good time, all of their interactions and things like that, except there was so much other stuff going on in this book that is really what got to me. And therefore I wasn't able to enjoy the romance for what it was because everything else was so distracting. Like, first of all, at the beginning of the book, this girl just got signed to be a professional model. Like literally the day she got signed, she goes to a baseball game, ends up getting hit in the face, and now her modeling career is over. So that already in itself is a pretty big deal. But then on top of that, she finds out that her boyfriend has been cheating on her with all of her roommates. And then on top of that, this guy has like this weird 3-date rule where he won't date a girl past the 3 dates, except he's somehow not a player, but he's also not celibate. So it was very confusing in that sense. And then he would keep going on like date after date just to like be social, which I thought was a tad weird. Like he would go on dates like while he's friends with this girl, and he was just like, oh yeah, I'm just going to like go out with my friends, but like I don't really care about my date, and I never really take it further. But then he would say how he wasn't celibate and he still does sleep around. So confusing things there. And then on top of that, like he had crazy freaking fans. Like at one point he was at a party with this girl, and then one of his fans tries drugging him and then like raping him, and like it doesn't end up happening because this girl overhears the plan that these other girls were having like in the bathroom, so she stopped it before it could go anywhere. But just the idea of it was so odd to me. And then on top of that, this guy, his father had abandoned him when he was a kid. And at the beginning of the story, he has this stalker who he later finds out is his father. And not only is his father trying to reconnect with him, but he also finds out that he has this half brother that he never knew existed. And then on top of that, once he lets his father back into his life, the father ends up getting involved with this girl's mother. And it's like, oh, isn't that adorable? Our parents are getting along. But I'm just like, you gotta stop with all of this like random other side stuff going on. Like, give me one or two of those things. Like, give me the abandoned father coming back into your life, or giving me this girl who her modeling career is over and now she's gonna have to deal with like, you know, the next chapter in her life. Like, give me one of those things. But there was just like literally a laundry list. I only shared with you a couple of random things that were happening in this book besides for the romance, and I just feel like when you hear it all together, it sounds like a freaking soap opera. So literally, I just could not stand everything else about this book, so therefore I ended up giving it a 2 stars, even though the romance in itself had potential. And I won't even get into the third act conflict that happened there, which basically caused a third act breakup, which was so over the top and unrealistic, and it basically, for so many reasons, this book just did not work for me, and I will not be recommending it to anybody in the future. But if you are somebody who did read it and did enjoy it, then I'm very happy that it did work out for you. So yeah, that is that. But anyway, after this, I have one more book that I wanted to share with you, which is Twice Shy by Sarah Hoggle. So in this story, you're following this girl who at the beginning of the book finds out that she just inherited a piece of property from her aunt who had just passed away. So she basically decides to quit her job and like, you know, pack up and move to this house that she just got for free. But when she gets there, she finds out that not only is the house in need of a ton of renovations, but also she's not the only person who ended up inheriting it. The groundskeeper who had worked there when her aunt was alive basically got half of it, and now they're gonna have to work together to fix it up and decide what they want to do with it. So it has a very forced proximity thing going on, and it is also a very short story. So I will say that it was a pretty cute read. I really did like the guy in this book. I thought that he was a pretty adorable cinnamon roll. I loved all of the grand gestures that he did. I loved all of the like, you know, odd things that were about him. Like he had social anxiety. He was very claustrophobic, and he had a lot of like, you know, interesting aspects to him. And I really did end up connecting to him as a character. But unfortunately, I really did not like Mallory, who was the main girl from the story. And what made it worse was that this was only from her POV. So because I wasn't connecting to her, I did have a bit of a hard time getting through the book, especially because she very much liked to like live in her head. She was a very big daydreamer, and that would confuse me and take me out of the story a lot. Like just every time that she would start a daydream, I would be like, oh wait, is this real or is this just happening in her head? And it would always take me a minute to catch on to what's going on. So I did have a little bit of a hard time going through this book, but honestly, the main guy in the story, I loved so freaking much. Like everything about him, I thought that he was like very, very adorable. So I did end up enjoying this book because of him, but I think that if he wasn't who he was in this book, I very much would have hated it. So yeah, a little bit of like, you know, mixed feelings towards it. I think that it's definitely worth the read, but it definitely wasn't my favorite read of all time, and it's probably going to be a bit forgettable. So yeah, more or less, I don't have a ton to say about this story. It's a pretty quick, short read. So yeah, that is about it. So yeah, I'm going to leave you guys here. That is all of the books that I ended up reading this past week. So I'm curious to know if you have read any of these books before in the past and what you thought about them. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. But either way, if you enjoyed watching this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you are not currently subscribed. But either way, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video because I really do appreciate it. And until next time, enjoy reading.